Welcome to Spiritual Cartel. Something a little bit different tonight. We are, and with great pleasure, we are being joined by Gail, who is going to come in and do a presentation with Bill Wilson for us. So extremely excited. Gail, over to you.
Hi, my name's Gail, and I'm going to be telling a story. I think I'll start with my story because we have enough time, and I think that kind of helps you understand a little bit how I got involved in telling our story. So here's a picture of me to qualify. It looks like I was a party girl too, like the rest of you. I'd like to tell you that's Woodstock. It's not. But I've got a cigarette in one hand and a half a gallon over there on the side and a deck of cards, and it kind of looks like my zipper might be down. I don't know, but that's my poster child picture to qualify. It's worth 1,000 words. And then here's another picture of me. I'm an alcoholic, so here's a picture of me in a blackout. Some of you might be able to relate to that. I got involved in the history when I read the only history. There was no history when I started. My sobriety date's May 13th of 1978. Nothing was going on, but I picked up this book, and oh my God, I found out that this thing I had fallen in love with, called Alcoholics Anonymous, started in my hometown. I drank because I didn't like Akron, Ohio, and here it's the birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I read the book, and I got really interested in the history. Interestingly, today we have quite a few books on it, but not back then. We do something in Akron every year. Around June 10th, we thought that was Dr. Bob's anniversary. So the founders, while Bob and Bill were alive, would come to Akron every June, and we still do this, where thousands gather and celebrate what we call AA's birthday. And we always try to hold it around June 10th. And I had gotten involved in the structure in Akron, which is, we have an intergroup board and an intergroup office. And I had been nominated to serve on the board. And while I was on the board, they said, we need someone to host Lois Wilson. Well, I had never been hosted. I didn't know what to do, but they said, well, when she comes, we just want you to take care of her and her companions and seat them. And so I said, okay, I think I can do that. So Lois Wilson came to Akron. Now, this is in about 83, maybe. Obviously, Bill has passed on, and so has Ann and Bob, but Lois was continuing to come. And she did bring some companions with her. And one of the companions is the lady in the back seat with the blue hat. And you're looking at Nell Wing. Nell Wing, as I was seating her at the banquet, we had a banquet, and I sat her down in front of Lois. And I was so grateful to have met her. And as I'm meeting her, she says, I was Bill Wilson's secretary. I was with him when he wrote the 12 and 12. Oh my God, I was so taken back by that. I ended up sitting down with her at the banquet, and as we were talking, I said, Nell, if there's ever anything I can do for you, just ask. Now watch when you say that if you're in service to anything, because somebody's going to ask you to do something. And she did. She said, yes, Gail, there is something I'd like you to do. I'd like you to start an archives. But I didn't know what an archives was. And, we all have a third step that we work. And I think we're all looking for, what are we supposed to do now that we're in recovery? And we're looking no longer for our will, but we're looking for God's will. And it's sort of like we wish he'd just call us up on the phone and tell us what he wants us to do. But looking back, I can see where so much unfolded. So I'll tell you just a little bit of what came next after that request. I want to tell you one more thing about Nell. There's a picture of Nell. She was the first archivist in Alcoholics Anonymous and was not an alcoholic, but just a true friend of Alcoholics Anonymous and a companion to Bill and Lois. She actually has her own book out. So I ended up calling her up, and I just like this picture because she was like a daughter to the Wilsons. If you visit the Wilson home, you'll see her bedroom. And it just looks like she's talking to Bill. I mean, she was just such an important figure in the history. And so I got involved in the purchase of Dr. Bob's home. From my interest from reading that book, I had driven by and said, if you as much as remove a doorbell from this house, give me a call. This had been rented by drug addicts and motorcyclists and alcoholics that would throw beer at the buses when they passed. We had done nothing in Akron with the history. And so I was asked if I would make a cold call on this guy. And I did. And I brought back a contract holding it in my name for about 6 months until we rolled it over into a foundation. And what I want to say is I met many of you on a tour that Bill was giving for you. And I was so impressed by this group and the emotion and the love you have for the history that I offered to do another talk for you. I think I've done one tour as well, but I did another talk because you are a family. I felt that this is a very impressive group of love that comes together, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. So anyway, we buy the house, and I call up Nell and I say, Nell, we have the house now. I can do what you asked me to do. And I said, but I don't know how to be an archivist. So she invited me into her home in New York. And I went out and she took me out to visit Lois. And here's a film of me visiting at Stepping Stones in 85, I believe, is when I visited. And here's Nell sitting in a chair in the lovely living room here. And in a minute, you're going to see a picture of me sitting on the couch with Lois. And I'd like to tell you that I am sober in that picture, but my hair hadn't sobered up yet. That is just a terrible picture of me early on. But it was a lovely visit where I learned that what work Bill did at Stepping Stones stayed at Stepping Stones, but the work he did in the office belongs to Alcoholics Anonymous. So I came back with a head full of information. And by the way, when we bought the house, there was 12 steps going up to the door. That's pretty incredible, but truthfully, there really was. And I came back to Akron, and I tried to tell the board then that this is how we would do it. They weren't too interested in what I had learned in New York. And I love our 3 legacies that you've already mentioned in the opening of this program. And so I broke off from the home at that time, and I began to take care of Alcoholics Anonymous history for another 18 years, putting it in our office. And today I am back at Dr. Bob's house doing the history work there. So that's kind of my background. The story you're about to hear is going to be on the writing of the big book. I was asked to do it in Toronto for the International, and it got so popular that they've asked me to do it every year since then. For over 20 years, I've been giving this talk at Founders Day, and it's going to have in it a talk that Bill Wilson gave in 1965 in Akron on the writing of the book. But I'm going to be giving you background before we go into that story. If you come to the office, you'll see this window, and this is how the house looks today. So anyway, this is the talk, the history of the writing of the big book. I hope you appreciate this slide. It took me about 6 weeks in a PowerPoint class to figure out how to do that. We're going to go back in time. I'm a recovering school teacher. We're going to go back in time to downtown Akron, as it might have looked when Bill and Bob walked the streets of Akron. We're a rubber town. This is a very industrial town with a lot of money coming from the Firestones and the Cyberlings who had Goodyear. So there was a lot of money going on in Akron at that time the story takes place. That's the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, one of our big companies. And here you're looking at the Firestone family. The center guy, of course, is Harvey. And next to him, the taller one, is a guy by the name of Bud. His real name was Russell, but his nickname was Bud. Now, this family had all kinds of money. And this kid is a bad alcoholic. And with all the money, power, and prestige that they had, that they threw at trying to help their son, nothing worked. I like to say all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Bud back together again. Now, here's another picture of Bud, but he's standing with a guy by the name of Jim Newton. Jimmy Newton, we're not in this program today, any of us, without some of these characters. I'm not sober today, and you're not in recovery today without Jimmy Newton, and you probably never heard of him. So you're going, oh yeah, well, why is he so important? Well, he is brought to Akron on a visit that Mr. Firestone was having down in Fort Myers, Florida, with Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. This kid is like a son to Edison, and he brings him to Akron and says, "I'm grooming you for a big position in the country, in the company." So he comes to Akron, takes a liking to Bud, wants to help Bud because when he was a young luggage salesman chasing pretty girls in Massachusetts, he thought he was going into a singles dance, but he followed him right into a hotel, right into an Oxford group meeting. Thank God, because he's now an Oxford grouper. And he decides that and that's our forerunner to our recovery program. He's going to take Bud on a train ride to Denver where the Oxford group is meeting, and they're going to do controlled drinking on the way. But on the way coming back, Sam Shoemaker, if you don't know who he is, you'll hear about him in a little bit. He's on the train and he pulls Jimmy into the train car. Jimmy gets down on his knees and they do a little soul surgery on him, and he makes that important surrender. When he gets off the train in Akron and the family goes to pick him up, he's not the same guy. He's different. The lines on his forehead are gone. He's no longer abusive to the family and the wife, and he becomes kind of a productive member of the family. So Mr. Firestone is so excited about that he decides that he's going to invite Frank Buchman and the Oxford. He's the founder of the Oxford group, but they traveled like a team, like an army for God. And they would get invited different places, and there would be like maybe 40 to 60 of them that would come as a team. And Buchman and the team is invited to Akron, and newspapers are all excited about this. They get a lot of press because the Cyberlings and the Firestones are all involved in this. All of our society is going to come out for this big thing. And where are they going to hold it? At the newly opened Mayflower Hotel. Some of you know about another story involving the Mayflower Hotel where our lives were held in the balance. Well, this is going to be January of 33. It's just, there's a depression going on, but they open it anyway. And they're going to hold a big dinner for 400. And all society people in Akron are coming out to hobnob with the Firestones and the Cyberlings. And who's going to give testimony to his recovery from alcoholism at that dinner? But Bud Firestone. And that's a key reason why AA is going to start in Akron with the Oxford group in January of 33. Now, they're going to hold what we call house parties, which are much like meetings today. They're going to hold them for the next 10 days in the morning and night. They're going to go out into the pulpit of the churches. And at this point in time, Henrietta is going to get Ann Smith involved in these meetings. So they're going to go. And then the Oxford group is going to leave, and they're going to start having meetings in Akron. And these two women are going to try and convince Dr. Bob that he should attend as well. Because of the depression, he doesn't have much of a practice. He's depressed. His drinking is bad. And he agrees to come and start attending the groups. The interesting thing about Bob is he swore he'd never go back to church, but he changes his mind and he starts going back to church. He reads the Bible. He prays. He goes to the meetings. He does everything that they're asking him to do. But in 2.5 years, with all of our principles, which this is very important, the principles that we have today, most of them come from the Oxford group, but he couldn't get sober on those. So I beg to think about the question here, why not? Why, if in 2.5 years, he's willing to do everything they're suggesting with all the principles, why doesn't he get sober? Well, there's some concern in the Oxford group because he and Anne are not sharing. And sharing was a very important part of the early movement. So this woman, Delphine Weber, calls up Henrietta Seiberling And she says, what are we going to do about Dr. Bob and Ann? They don't share. And so the important thing that happens next is something that Henrietta did that takes us all the way to today, I believe. The reason why this story all can come together is because in the Oxford group, it was very important that you took a morning quiet time. And in that quiet time, you would say a prayer, maybe you'd read from a devotional, and then you sat in the quiet with pencil and paper and wrote down whatever you thought the Holy Spirit was saying to you. And this is what she did. So this was called guidance. And then and it's to me like she downloaded intervention. Most of you may know what intervention is because you can watch it on TV today. We didn't know what intervention was back in 1935. No one had ever heard of it. So she perfectly would download intervention. Excuse me. She's going to call up her friends, T. Henry and Clarice Williams, who own this beautiful home. He's a tire mold inventor for National Rubber Machinery Shop, which Bill's coming to town for the takeover. He almost lost his home because he lost his job because of Bill Wilson. But Henrietta will call them and she'll say, look, can we use your home for a special meeting for Dr. Bob and Ann? And they agreed because the banks had just stopped from taking this home. They had taken so many homes during the Depression, they didn't take this home. They said, this home is God's home. So they decided, she said, well, we're going to plan this, just like they do in an intervention. So she called a meeting and she called them all the group together and she said, come prepared to mean business. There's not going to be any pussyfooting around. We're going to share and we're going to share deeply. So they practiced it. It took place on a Wednesday at 8 o'clock in this living room. And they all went around the living room and they shared whatever was important to them that they would have difficulty sharing. And when it came Dr. Bob's turn, he looked up at them and he thanked them. And now he said, at the cost of my profession, there is something I need to share with you. I am a secret drinker and I cannot stop. There's step one. You see, the Oxford group was all things to all people. And Bob and Ann wouldn't share because identification is just that important. You can have all the principles, but without identification, then you don't feel like you can share. So then they said the next most important thing. They said, Bob, would you like us to pray for you? And he said, yes. And they all got down on their knees and they prayed for Dr. Bob in the living room. This was at Wednesday at 8 o'clock. The next thing that happens is Bill Wilson comes to Akron within about 2 weeks. He's at the Mayflower Hotel. He's managed to stay sober by helping others. And now the deal has fallen through. He's got $10 to his name. He's standing in front of the elevators through the lobby there. And thinks maybe he'll go into the bar and strike up a drink or a friend or something. And instead, he remembers that he had stayed sober by helping others, and he walks over to the phone, he puts a nickel in the phone, and he calls the most perfect person that he could call, which was Reverend Tunks. And that was the Firestone minister who had brought the Oxford group to town. And he ends up through a series of phone calls, getting connected to Henrietta Seiberling, who since the intervention has been praying for Dr. Bob every day. Every day she is in her morning quiet time praying. So when she gets the phone call from Bill, she thinks, manna from heaven. You know, he's going to say to this proper lady, well-bred, high society lady, hi, I'm a drunk hound from New York. I'm a member of the Oxford group and I'm looking for another alcoholic. And that's when she thinks manna from heaven. She knows that's an answer to her prayer. She's going to call Ann up. They're going to try to get Bob over there. Bob's too drunk. It's Mother's Day weekend, 1935. But the next day, Bob is so shaky and he's feeling so bad that he agrees to come to the gate lodge, where in this little room where it takes place. But he's going to agree to come, but he's not going to stay. He's only going to give Bill Wilson 15 minutes. But Bill understands alcoholism. And the thing that Bill says to Bob is, it looks like you could use a drink. I think that particular sentence changed the whole scenario of what would happen next. Bob knows, Bill knows. And no one seems to, everyone preaches at alcoholics, but no one really understands. And so Bob had that connection with Bill, and they'll retire to the little library there. And for the next 5 hours, we'll that's where the spark gets struck, start the process of what would become Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill's going to stay in Akron. By the way, that's a picture of the little room. You can visit it today if you make it to Akron. Now, what they don't know a lot at this point of how to even pass it on. They don't. But they know if they're going to stay sober, they better find somebody else to work with, or they won't be able to keep what they have. So after some failures, they end up on making a call on the third man, which we call Bill D, in City Hospital. And in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it tells you that when he leaves City Hospital, a free man, to never drink again, that's when AA group number 1 began. And the date of that is July 4th, 1935. So first we get a special day, which is Mother's Day weekend. And then the next special day we get is for us, not for you folks in England, but for us in the United States. That's our Independence Day. So the next thing that happens is they now have a group. And that group is going to meet at the same time the prayer was said on Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the same home where the prayer was said. Oh, that was a joke. Okay. So we don't have a book yet, but we have 4 words: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. Those are called the 4 absolutes. Those were the only yardsticks that we had before the book gets written in 39 and the steps come out. And we had very good recovery using these 4 words. But there's 4 questions that we still use today to measure behavior. Is what I'm about to think, say, or do right or wrong, true or false, ugly or beautiful, and how does it affect the other guy? So we're going to continue to meet here at T. Henry's home for 4.5 years. We are not Alcoholics Anonymous. We are just what we call flying blind. We don't know what we are. We know some people are managing to stay sober. We're using Oxford Group principles. We're using their homes. We're using their guidance, and it's working. Now, when the guys couldn't stay sober for the quiet time, Dr. Bob would take them into the upper room and he would get the surrenders. He was known as the Prince of 12 Steppers. And I want to mention Ann Smith. Ann Smith's going to start working with the wives as well. We're going to leave this stage now, and we're going to go to the New York stage where something's going on here at Calvary Church, which is Sam Shoemaker's church. It is at this time the headquarters of the Oxford Group. This is where Ebby's going to go. At the mission here is where they were holding these meetings as well. And Bill's going to come down here looking for Ebby when he makes his altar call. And then that's after Bill had visited, Ebby had visited with Bill in the kitchen, over the kitchen table. Most of you probably know that story. And then Bill's going to end up in Towns after be his 4th visit when he finally has that white light experience. And he kind of gets singleness of purpose there, where he sees how his experience can benefit others. And from then on, he only wants to work with alcoholics. He will begin attending Oxford Group meetings at Calvary House, right there in that same area. And that's Bill and Lois's meeting, as it would have appeared before it became AA. But what happened is Oxford Group wants to be all things to all people. Bill's had this spiritual experience, and he only wants to work with alcoholics. So the Oxford Group in 1937 gives Bill and Lois the cold shoulder and kind of says to them, hey, look, we're not real happy with what you're putting out here. So Bill and Lois are going to leave the Oxford group, and they're going to start meeting in their home on Clinton Street. And in Akron, in T. Henry's home, you have a group that became the Alcoholic Squad. That's what they called themselves. They're a subgroup of the Oxford group. So at this time, you have two groups, one in Akron that was in T. Henry's home, and now you have Bill's group, which is called the Drunk Squad, or a nameless bunch of drunks, is going to meet in Bill's home. At the same time, in 37, Bill's going to come back to Akron. He's going to stay with Dr. Bob and Ann, and they don't know what they have. They didn't know what was going on, but they're sitting in the living room counting noses. That's kind of what you did. You kind of said, well, Abby, Abby drank during this time, which was very sad for them, but they come up with 40 people sober. Yeah, I had to Photoshop Bill in here, so please forgive me. I needed the three of them together for this talk. Anyway, and it should say 1937. That's wrong on that heading there. But anyway, they count 40 people sober. Now, something very spiritual happened to them at that point. They realized that a light had come into the dark world of the alcoholic. Something had taken hold. I don't know, that number 40 or whatever. They had this moment of ecstasy. And the next thing they did is they bowed their heads in thanksgiving and prayer for gratitude for what they had seen. The next thing that happens is Bill had been working at Wall Street. He knew about this chain of drugstores. He comes up with the idea, we need a chain of hospitals and missionaries and some literature. So Bob wasn't so sure about that. They had that group started in Akron, and they decided to take it over to the group to see what the group thought about it. So you can just picture Bob and Bill. Now, they always agreed to disagree agreeably, which is an important lesson for all of us. And so the two of them, if it was up to Dr. Bob, AA would have never left Akron, but if it was up to Bill, he'd have franchised it. So here you see a cute little film of the two of them. I don't know if you've ever seen this film before, but you can kind of see the friendship. You can kind of get an idea what was going on back then. They're certainly having a good time in their sobriety. You can get a little bit of Bob with his ears and his wild ties. I don't know exactly what they're saying, but Bob's trying to probably tell Bill to keep it simple. Let's not louse it up. In a minute, you're going to see, this is one of the first films ever taken. And you're going to see a picture of Ann Smith. Now, Ann Smith is the mother of AA. And I think it's important that we realize what the women were doing at this time that was really helpful. Most of us would have left these guys, but we owe her a deep debt of gratitude. She just wants to stay in the background, so she doesn't want any notoriety at all. So you can see that. All right, so the next thing that happens is they go back to T. Henry's home where the groups have been meeting, and they're going to put this idea before the group that's there. Bill is going to come up with the idea that we need a chain of hospitals, we need paid missionaries, and we need literature to keep the message from getting garbled. Now, you know what garbled, if any of you have ever played telephone, you know that when you play telephone, by the time you're done passing the message. So that was Bill's point. But Akron people were kind of conservative. We say the man of Galilee had no press agents, newspapers, pamphlets, or books. Keep it simple, Bill. Bill says you can keep it so simple, you're going to have anarchy. Bill never stopped caring about all those that are suffering that we don't reach, that we weren't able to get to. So he's saying there are alcoholics dying within gunshot of this house. So he lobbies for that, and they take it to a vote. And just barely, I think there were 19 people there, one vote over, they're going to send Bill back to New York to get the money. But there's a depression going on, and it's really hard to get money. And they're going to pitch the rich. They tried it, and the people say, Bill, and Hank's involved at this time. And they're saying, you know what? We'd rather give to the Salvation Army or the Red Cross. 40 people sober, not a big deal. So Bill gets pretty depressed. And he's at his home in Clinton Street, and he's having one of his imaginary ulcer attacks. Thank God his sister has married a doctor. You're looking at Dr. Leonard Strong, a very important person in the whole story of recovery. He's footing the bill for Towns. He later is going to become a trustee. At this point, he picks up the phone, calls a friend, gets him an appointment. Now remember, he's got an ulcer, he's really depressed, and he's going to get an appointment to meet with Reverend Willard Richardson. And Willard Richardson is going to invite him up to the Rockefeller office. Can you imagine this? Bill goes from depression to the headquarters of the Rockefellers and into their boardroom. And he says this on the way up: on what slender threads our destiny does lie. Now, and I think that's true for all of us, so you probably have your own slender threads, but I think the slender threads are the key to this whole story I'm telling you. So you have Leroy, Chipman, and the rest of them, and they decide that they're going to invite Bill back, Bob, and a few early members back to talk to the board. Now, in December of that year, they're in the boardroom of the richest man in the world. Well, it's his son, J.D. Rockefeller, and the board members, the smartest men in the country. We don't talk very much about this, but wow, what a godsend this is. And they don't know what to do. So here's what some of the people are. You can see we've got a variety of characters. We've got a couple alcoholics up there in yellow, and we got the board members, including Dr. Silkworth and Leonard Strong. And so they look at each other, and the new guys, they've only got a year or two sober, and they're in the boardroom of J.D. Rockefeller. They go to look, and they go, what do we do? What do we say? And then one of them just said, why don't we do what we always do? Why don't we just tell our stories? What a simple, beautiful idea. So they do that. And the next thing you know, Albert Scott jumps up and says, well, this is first century Christianity. Gentlemen, up to this point, this has been the good work of goodwill only. No plan, no property, no paid people, just one carrying the good news to the next. Isn't that true? And may it not be that this is where the great power of this great society lies. Frank Amos decides he's going to come to Akron and check out what's going on there. He's going to recommend $50,000. Dr. Bob's ready to lose his home because they're taking homes because it's the depression. So they're going to try to help him with his home. They're going to start some hospitals in Akron. They're going to put Dr. Bob in charge. They're going to subsidize a few people, start a chain of hospitals, and get busy on that book. Well, what happened is the $50,000 got shrunk down as it went across the desk over to JD. But JD says, somehow I'm strangely stirred by all this, but isn't money going to ruin this thing? Very important to understand the traditions. Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller. And yet he says, I am so strangely stirred by all this. To me, that's a higher power. Just the way he states that sentence. What is stirring him to be so interested in following this movement? Not with money, though. He just says, I want to hear what goes on, but please don't bother me for any more money. No, I won't be the one to spoil this thing with money. A very important part of our history right there. So that is not what they wanted to hear. I need to tell you, they are so hungry. Times are so hard. But the $50,000 gets shrunk down to $5,000. They use some of the money, $3,000, to pay off the house. And now I don't want to argue about this because historians are always digging up something that'll tell you I'm a little off on this, but this is conference approved stuff. Anyway, $2,000 go into the Riverside Church. Harry Emerson Fosdick is the pastor. He'll write the first big book review in the New York Times. And the co-founders will try to survive a depression while trying to start a movement in the darkest times in our country's history. They're going to get this young attorney to make a foundation in 1938. And they're going to have Class A and Class B trustees. I'm not going to go into all that. But I will tell you that Dr. Bob is on that. And Bill's off to the side in an advisory capacity. I now want to introduce you to Hank Parkhurst. Hank Parkhurst is Bill's first sponsee out of towns. He was a red-haired, tall, broad-shouldered former athlete with a salesman drive and lots of enthusiasm. He had at least one new idea a minute and plenty of energy. He's going to become the big promoter of the big book idea. He started a company called Honors Dealers, and Bill was a salesman for it. And this is one of the first offices for it. This is the second office for it. This is the office where the big book will be written. The Honors Dealers is the Calumet building, and it's no longer there. They tore it down, but it's in New Jersey. But when they put it back up, they put this plaque up. And it was in this site in 1938 on the 6th floor. The Honor Dealers, the pioneers of a fledgling fellowship, wrote the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And from this title, Worldwide Society would take its name, Alcoholics Anonymous, which has since helped millions of men and women recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body known as alcoholism. So that's all that remains there, but thank God there's a plaque. They're going to hire this gal here. This is Ruth Hawk, and she's incredible, great typist, but I don't think she knew what she was getting herself in for. She says in Pass It On, they're sitting at the table, and the caption under the table is, she didn't know what was going on in the office because car products weren't being sold. Somebody was either passed out or making a surrender. That's pretty much what was going on at the time. So we didn't have any money to pay her. So they have no money. You're going to hear in a few minutes how hungry they were. So they go down to the stationery store and they get some worthless stock certificates. And they tried to sell these. And this is what they paid her with. She got a ration of one of these a week for her hard work in typing the book. Her typewriter is at the General Service Office. I don't know if any of you recall trying to type on one of these, but that machine pretty much drove me to drink during my graduate work. Oh my God, are we lucky to have word processors today? So God bless her for as many times as she typed up what would become the manuscript copy of the big book. Another shot of that. So Hank is the promoter. It's his idea to write the book. If you get a chance to study the outlines, they're in a book that came out in the writing of the big book, you can see that Bill's pretty much going to follow Hank's ideas. And so these are just some of the ideas that he's going to give Bill as structure to write the book. And then he's going to get involved also in the prospectus. These are really interesting when you study them. So what went into the writing of the big book? Well, we know from other historians that, of course, William James, Varieties of Religious Experience, was an important book. What is the Oxford Group? That one is the key textbook. By the way, after Nell Wing asked me to start the archives, I had no archives. There was nothing. We had nothing to put in archives. I happened to be at a festival on the property of the Cyberlings. Right behind the gate lodge was a tent of old books. And I was looking for anything to put in the archives. And I said, do you have any old AA books? And they said, no. I said, would you have any spiritual books? And they said, yes. And there was about a dozen books. My hand went to a little blue book and I pulled it out and it said, what is the Oxford Group? And I didn't know history very well then. I thought, is that what we were? Or were we the movement? Or were we the group? I didn't know. But when I opened the book up, it said R.H. Smith, 855 Ardmore, his book, Please Return. Another sign for me, because I couldn't have found that book if I tried. I say that book found me, and I donated it to Dr. Bob's home. So you'll find it there if you get a chance to visit. Common Sense of Drinking, a very important early movement with Richard Peabody. Sermon on the Mount, many of you may be familiar with that because we seem to have retained that book in the fellowships. Pretty much keep that book close, just as we would conference-approved literature almost. And For Sinners Only by A.J. Russell, another Oxford Group book. We need a big thank you to Ebby Thatcher. Many of you probably study the big book, no matter what programs you're in. And if you look at Bill's biography in there, we all know we think Bill wrote the 12 steps. But when you read Bill's biography that he wrote before chapter 5, you can number every step in there that Ebby gives him between Clinton Street and Towns Hospital. Yes, he wrote it down, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but man, we owe a big debt of gratitude to Ebby Thatcher. He made the most perfect 12-step call on Bill Wilson with only 2 months of sobriety. So just think about what you can do with 2 months if Ebby Thatcher could do what he did in 2 months. All right, so Bill's going to ask Anne to write a chapter. She declines, and he never asked Lois, so she had a bit of a resentment from that. We know that Bill will write chapter to the wives. He's going to start out with one of his, he's going to have 3 documents when he starts out. There is a Solution, by the way, is one of the first ones that he writes, along with his biography and an introduction. Then he finds out about, he gets a tip that Eugene Exman from Harper's, the religious editor, might be interested in those 3 documents. So he takes them to Eugene, and Eugene gets pretty excited about it. And he says, Bill, this is pretty good. Can you write more? And he says, yeah, I can. He said, well, I'd like to give you a $1,500 advance on this book. Now, remember, Bill's hungry. He's broke, and he gets it's a lot of money back then. You don't put it in terms of today, but it was a lot of money. So the next thing that happens, oh, wait a minute. Oh, hi, Bill. Bill, you're not going to believe this. We're on Zoom.
Now then.
All right, you take it away.
As a graphic illustration of how pain and fear and all of our worst motives can eventuate under God's grace for the best, I would like to, in a hop, skip, and jump fashion, tell you about the preparation of the AA book.
Well, Bill, by the way, we're talking to England. It's pretty exciting. And I always like it when you show up, because then I don't have to tell it. I'd rather hear if you tell it. I did tell them about the $1,500 advance. What did you decide to do with that?
A few of us stood for the proposition, well, this would be bad because control of our literature would be in other hands. And some of us, in a more self-serving way, and this definitely included me, we felt that the book might make some profits and some royalties out of which its creators could eat.
I've already told them you were hungry, but I know you've got these ideas about writing a book, but you have like under 100 people sober. You're not going to get anybody to buy the book if you don't have some publicity. So what did you decide to do?
Some of us in New York considered the possibility of publishing this book ourselves.
And so how did you get the word out?
So then we went up to the Reader's Digest and told them about our budding movement. And I guess we brandished Mr. Rockefeller's name pretty liberally, you know, as a close friend. He wasn't giving us any money, but he liked us.
Well, I'm really glad that he liked you. Well, did they like the idea? What'd they say?
The Digest said, well, fine. When will your book come out? By now, it's the fall of 38. All they said about next spring. They said, this is just the kind of story that we'd like. We will do a piece. We'll put a feature writer on this.
Well, that was good news, but again, you're not really a writer at this time. Didn't you have some fears?
Who would publish such a book? Who could assemble such a book? What should go in it? Supposing it turned out badly. These, indeed, for us, were great and most natural fears.
So what did you do next?
And then a plan came into being. It was thought there ought to be a text. It was thought these ought to be backed up by stories. And this text was in the first edition. 2/3 of the stories came from Akron.
Yay. So how are you going to finance this plan?
So down east, we began to peddle stock in what turned out to be the AA book, but we were peddling stock to drunks, $25 a share. The purpose was what? To feed Wilson and the gal who helped do the book and the promoter and the collector of the money.
Food is definitely on your mind. Why did you call it Works?
The title was chosen because there would be a lot more work, after this.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about this prospectus, this idea of the stocks and how you were going to sell those.
So in the prospectus, we totted up what the profits would be. Oh, I think we started in with something like 100,000 books, and the first few carloads, and I think we got as high as 1 million copies. Well, of course, if they only cost 35 cents and you sold them for $3.50, it would be frankly a great rise in that $25 stock. Might go to $1,000 a share. We didn't put all this on paper, but it was a part of the promotion.
Yeah, that promotion. Boy, you guys saw dollar bill signs, didn't you? How did you present it then to get sales?
We would sell these 35-cent books for the sum of $3.50. We didn't indicate any other expenses, but that seemed quite a margin of profit to the prospective stock buyer. And we pointed out that they couldn't possibly miss, because after all, the digest piece with millions of circulation, in which they definitely would mention the new book, would simply move these volumes out in carloads.
I know, that's what you thought.
While this job was being done. In other words, people were asked to buy stock in a book that hadn't yet been written. I think this is a world's record for sheer audacity.
So do we, Bill. Hey, so when word got out, what was the reaction?
Well, this was heard out in this country, that this ex-Wall Street swindler was contriving one of the greatest rackets known to the mind man.
And what else was the reaction with the groups?
Well, when this motivation began to be suspected and became apparent, quite a violent opposition rose up.
Violent, huh? Wow, I don't know if you've ever told us about that. So what was your next step then?
So then we had only begun our troubles. Then the book had to be written.
So I guess you'd start writing the book then, yes?
Well, I wrote another sample chapter and tried that on them. No stock purchases.
Ooh, still broke, huh? Well, what did the trustees say about that?
And the trustees were very dubious. They had no money at the time, so we were able to face them down and say, well, we'll separately incorporate this. And sure enough, by an appeal to the loyalty of the stockholders to the cause, but also by an appeal to the pocketbook, the baser nature, the money began to dribble in, $25 per bet.
Wow, that was relief. Now you can get started on the actual writing of the book. Tell us about that.
However, we were reading, a few of us, on the stockholders' money.
Good.
And little by little, the chapters were evolved. And we thrashed them around in the AA meetings, and we carefully checked them with Dr. Bob as they went along. And meanwhile, he, at great pains and difficulty, got stories, largely from this town.
Yeah, 3/5 of the stories actually we actually have now on display in Dr. Bob's home, the original table with and they were so reluctant. They did not want to write those stories. they were just newly sober and didn't see themselves as authors for sure. But they reluctantly did it. And then Sue, Dr. Bob's daughter, actually typed them up on that typewriter that we have there. So we're really glad that people can now visit and hear that story in Dr. Bob's house. Now, as I understand it, you were writing chapters and you were passing them to Akron and trying to let them know what was going on, and then you would wait for their feedback. So and you were writing on these big yellow tablets, and the groups in Akron were doing so much 12-step work. I don't know that they were always as interested in the writing as they were in the 12-step work that was going on in Akron. When it came time for the writing of the 12 steps, I know you were really depressed that night. Can you tell us a little bit about how those came out?
In short, here was AA at its worst, but under God's grace, coming up with something better. Maybe history will say the best. And so the work went on, and I remember one night we got through the first 4 chapters, which were window dressing, and I was having an imaginary ulcer attack, and it looked like, well, things were very gloomy. The stockholders were kind of, falling down. The meal ticket was getting in danger, and I was very resentful. And I realized, lying in bed there in Brooklyn, Clinton Street, that the book had to say what it was all about at some place. So I began to write, and out came the 12 steps.
Well, not at first. I think you started with something that you had put together, which was 6 steps. Now, we don't want to confuse that with the Oxford group, because the Oxford group did not have steps. But you had taken 6 ideas, key ideas, and written them down. But that night you looked at them and you said, well, wait a minute. An alcoholic could fall through the cracks of those 6 steps. And that's when you expanded them and you made them into 12. And then you wanted to share them with your group. What happened when you did?
Well, when they appeared, there was a terrific uproar. And as a result of the uproar, again, the constructive came out. I had had a great spiritual experience, so that I had used God all the way through those 12 steps.
I'm kind of laughing because you were talking about violent opposition, and now you're talking about an uproar. These are the beginning of AA really had some tumultuous times, didn't it? Well, what did the atheists think of the 12 steps when they saw them?
Our atheist and agnostic contingent said, drunks aren't going to buy that. They're scared to death of being God-bitten. This ought to be a psychological book.
Well, okay, but what did the religious people think of it? Because you had both in your group. What did they say?
On the other hand, the religious people said that it should be a strictly Christian book, theologically speaking. So one had to sort of average these point of views.
And that's when you said, when you tell this story, you said you felt more like an umpire between these 2 polarities. And that's when you came up with God as you understand him. And that you called a 10th strike. And that is so beautiful because today, this is a worldwide fellowship. And because of that, anyone can come into Alcoholics Anonymous with a God of their understanding. And so, do you think you had God's help writing this book?
Sure, we must have had God's help. We never could have produced it ourselves.
So would you be kind enough to kind of summarize the writing of the big book up for us?
So this is the unholy way in which God nevertheless graced us in the days when AA was very young.
I love it. The unholy way. You tell that story so well, but there's more to this story. We're not to the publication of the big book. That's a whole nother story. Would you tell us about the publication?
Well, finally, the great day, our publication approached. We had pre-publication copies of the book made, circulated around for criticism. And with the last of our money, almost the last, We persuaded the printer that this was such a terrific venture that he certainly ought to accept a 10% down payment for 5,000 books, which were going out with the carload, this first installment. So we paid him $500 for 5,000 books.
What a deal. Then you had sent out copies of this, 400 copies of the manuscript prior to the publishing of the big book went out, and you sent it to the clergy, you sent it to doctors, you wanted feedback before you went to press, and you got some feedback, and one of them was that you should put in a doctor's opinion, which you put in your Dr. Silkworth's opinion in that book. And then as the ideas came back, it went through so many revisions. I mean, you started out with your words, but by the time everyone was finished with it, it was a mess. Here's a bigger copy of it where we can see here that the word your, Y-O-U-R, was crossed out. Y became our. Other things were crossed out and we was put in, and we're still we today. So many of these suggestions went into the working copy, which you then would take to Cornwall Press. And you and Dorothy Snyder and Ruth and Hank would have to typeset it there because it was such a mess. Today we can study that because we have a coffee table kind of book where these documents are in. I love what it says on the left of this. Thy will be done. We don't rush God. That is beautiful. So what a process. What a process. And Hank was a big part of this as well. And then what to call it. So you guys thought, well, we'll call it the 100 Men Corporation. But then Florence Rankin got sober and she said, you can't call it 100 men. You better call it 100 men and one woman. The Bill W. movement, that wouldn't have been a terrible idea, Bill. Well, we were calling ourselves the Alcoholic Squad in Akron. You were a nameless bunch of drunks in New York. Dry Frontiers was a name, Empty Glass. Again, Akron wanted to be the way out. And I guess this program is the way out. And then because you were the nameless bunch of drunks, this guy came in, his name was Joe, and he was sitting in a corner and he was going, Anonymous Alcoholics, Anonymous Alcoholics. And then he switched it and he said, Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's what stuck. What did you think about that?
We'd been calling ourselves out there a nameless bunch of drunks, and from that, the anonymity idea had come in. In fact, the book title, as voted by Akron, New York, and a few Clevelanders, was chosen as The Way Out. But in the Library of Congress, we'd found that there were 12 books by the name of The Way Out. So for heaven's sake, we couldn't make a 13th, so it became Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay, well, now you're ready to go back to Reader's Digest and get the publicity out because you've got 5,000 big books ready to go.
Then we went up to the Digest and said, now, what about this piece? We're all ready to shoot. And the editor whom we had talked vaguely remembered us, and he said, shoot what?
Oh, no, Bill. You had all those stock certificates out. You're $10,000 in debt. Everything's riding on this article. That's how you sold those stock certificates. A third was to go to you, a third was to go to Hank, and you sold a third of them to anybody that would listen to you. And now it's pay up time. And they said that, oh my God, what did you say to them?
Well, we reminded our friend that a piece was due, and he said, gee, Mr. Wilson, he said, after you were here, I went to the rest of the staff here very sure that this would be a great piece, but they didn't think so, and I forgot to tell you.
Oh my God. Well, what was the state of AA after that?
So we had 5,000 books in the warehouse. There were 100 AA members. There were about 30 stockholders, and they each got a book. There were about 30 guys who put stories in the books, and they each got a book, and that was 60 books. So we only had 40 books to sell the rest if they'd buy it.
These were some really, really dark times for you and Lois. honors dealers, the whole thing. Tell us about that.
Well, at that time, things folded up in a big way. We were about to be evicted from our house in Clinton Street. Stuff go into storage. The book was bankrupt, and we made one last great gasp effort.
Oh, what was that, Bill?
A drunk came along by the name of Morgan who had been in the ad business, and he said, you know, I know Gabriel Heater. You know, the guy who puts on those wonderful sob talks. And he said, I think Gabriel would put this on the air. So we scared up a few dollars more. And to get ready for Gabriel, we decided.
What is so funny, Bill?
Well, we picked out a hard class of people to advertise to in those days. We picked out all of the physicians east of the Mississippi River, all of them. And to each one, we sent a postal card which said, listen to Gabriel Heater as he talks about the new society of Alcoholics Anonymous. And buy the book Alcoholics Anonymous, A Cure for Alcoholism.
Well, wasn't there a little bit of a problem with Morgan Ryan?
Well, one great trouble with Ryan was that he wouldn't sober up, and he was supposed to be interviewed on the air. My God, our last cent was in this thing and all these postal cards.
Well, what did you do to solve that problem?
So just as a precaution, one of our friends who was a member of the Down Athletic Club said, well, now, you can have my room over there. I don't use it much. And why doesn't somebody live with Morgan in there the week before, you know, to just stay with him and be sure he gets the heater all right?
That's crazy. Well, did it work?
So the great day came. The postal card was out. In Akron, New York, Cleveland, the ears were to the radio. We visioned the books going out in carloads, orders flooding in. Biggest profit of all in direct mail, no commissions. And sure enough, Heater pulled out the tremolo stop. Ryan was sober. And boy, we were made.
Wow. So now you tell us about the post office box. I know that you had a post office box. I know that after it, you felt that it was going to be huge. So you waited 3 days to go check, and you were going to bring suitcases. But tell us more about the post office.
We gave a post office box, old 458 in New York, I think it was, where we had a one-room office. Little Ruthie Hawk, who helped me with the book, bless her soul, my promoter friend Hank Parkhurst and I just couldn't wait to get over to see what was coming into that box.
I know. And when you
Hank was an incorrigible optimist. He said, well, they couldn't put them all in the box. He said they got several mail bags full out there.
I know you were so disappointed when you looked in and just saw just a handful of cards.
The clerk came with the cards. Hank said, ain't there any more? No. We took them over to the desk and we counted them, and there were 12. And 10 of them were from doctors, obviously stewed themselves, who lambasted the hell out of us. And we had exactly 2 orders for the book Alcoholics Anonymous.
This is a hard story, Bill. You're homeless. The business has fallen apart. You got 5,000 books. You're in debt and owe all this money. And somehow we do end up pulling it out. But can you summarize this part of the story?
For us, Almost more than any other society, pain has been the touchstone of our spiritual progress. So we can say, thank God that we have suffered such pain, that such a spectacle as this has been brought into view and being.
Well, thank you, Bill. Hey, Bill, say hello to Dr. Bob for us, and thanks for showing up. I'm going to finish the story because it's not over yet. We almost don't make it. I mean, I think to appreciate recovery, you have to understand what a miracle it is that this story gets pulled out at all. First of all, they published this thing we call the Big Book. It was so big. There's you're looking at the circus jacket because it looked like a circus. Can you imagine trying to be an anonymous member of Alcoholics Anonymous, walking down the street with the Big Book with that cover? I don't think so. The story in Bill's Big Book, his very first copy off the press, he says, this was the very first AA book off the press. We used thick paper to make sure the alcoholic felt they were getting their money worth. For any of you that have read that book, I hope you've gotten your money's worth out of it. There's a little article on the next page. By the way, this book resides at Stepping Stones. To Lois, one whose loving care and fortitude in our dark days together made these pages possible. So to her, this first book of the first edition is lovingly and thankfully given by Bill in memory of their 5th Christmas in 39. That's when the book comes out in April. So here's the kind of an important story along with these slender threads. They're broke. AA's done. It's over, except for one possibility. Since Reader's Digest canceled them, there is a chance that they might get an article done in Liberty Magazine, but they don't have enough money to make it to that article. They can't get there. So they call up Bert the tailor. He had a tailoring shop on Fifth Avenue, but it wasn't doing too well because of the Depression. And they had asked him for money, and he said, no, I wish I could help you, but I can't. So he says, but I know of someone by the name of Mr. Cochran. Maybe Mr. Cochran would buy up books for $1 less and put them in the libraries. So they called up Cochran. He calls up Mr. Cochran. And Mr. Cochran wants to see our financials. And after he sees our financials, he said, no, I can't lend you the money. But Bert says, Mr. Cochran, will you loan me the money? And he hocked his business to get us to the very first article that appears in September of 39. It's called Alcoholics and God by Morris Markey. This is important, but only 600 inquiries came in. Now remember, we're still not out of the woods yet, but at least we have a little publicity, but not enough to really help with the amount of debt that we had and trouble we were in. So the next thing that'll happen in 1940 is the Rockefellers are going to throw a dinner. And this dinner is going to be important because of the Rockefeller name again, but we're looking for money. So these are some of the people that were there at the dinner, very prominent people like J.P. Morgan, a lot of bankers, a lot of people with a lot of money were assembled there. Morgan Ryan, the good-looking Irishman that was on the radio show, was there. Nelson Rockefeller resided over that because his dad wasn't well. And he says, my father thinks this is a work of goodwill and that money is going to ruin it. And at that point, a couple $1 billion walked out the door. Now, what they had done was they had put a person at each table. One of those guys was Morgan Ryan that was sitting at a table with bankers. And one of the bankers looked at him and said, and what institution are you with? And he said, well, I'm not really with any institution, but I got out of one not too long ago. 400 books were sold for $1 a piece of those beautiful big red books. Pamphlets were printed up and sent out, and personal signed letters by J.D. Rockefeller were also sent out. And that gave us a little bit of a boost. Excuse me, but we're not out of the woods. Jack Alexander had been busting rackets. And he got an opportunity to write a story on Alcoholics Anonymous. He thought we were a racket. He came to Akron and a few other cities to bust Alcoholics Anonymous. But it's through attraction we promote. And because of what he saw, it turned him around. And he wrote this glowing endorsement of Alcoholics Anonymous in the Saturday Evening Post, March 1941. And I believe 6,000 inquiries came in. This is the book, this is the article that saved Alcoholics Anonymous and got those big books moving. Without this article, I don't know that we would be in recovery today. There's no way of knowing. So each one of these things plays such an important part. We end up paying J.D. Rockefeller back. These are some of the checks, including Charlie Towns. There's one there to Towns. We end up having a little office in New York as we started the foundation. And then this is one of my closing slides here, because the story I told you, I'm sure you heard them talk about being hungry. I'm sure you knew they were homeless. I'm sure you saw the disappointment, whether it's the cards or whatever it is. It's a hard story. These are really dark, hard times. Now you're looking at a picture where it's been turned around and big books are now being printed. And here's the lovely couple sitting in the office watching these big books. And Bill says in a talk in Texas, it transcended the mountain and the seas and is even at this moment lighting candles in dark caverns and on distant beaches. So knowing this story, what I'd like you to do is just sit back, and I'm going to bring up the cast of people that were in this particular story that I told. I mean, there's more characters, but in this story, and I want you to just reflect on your own recovery. And I challenge you to remove one name. Would this story even exist? Bert T., Abby, Bill, Lois, Jack Alexander, Mr. Cochran, Henrietta Seiberling, T. Henry and Clarice Williams, John D. Rockefeller, Frank Amos, Albert Scott, Willard Richardson, Leonard Strong, Dr. Bob, Ann Smith, Dr. Silkworth, Ruth Hawk, and of course, Hank P. But all the credit for this story, I believe, goes to the higher power. The real author of this story is the higher power. Thank you.